I was standing at the survey console with one hand on the throttle and the other holding the phone when Callie answered. The connection had been weak all day. It came and went depending on which way the petrel swung at anchor, and right then her voice sounded like it was coming through a long metal pipe.
Alvin,
Yeah,
where are you?
40 miles offshore, near Hesed ahead. There was a burst of static between us. I looked out through the wheelhouse windows while I waited for her to come back. It was getting dark over the water. The last light was lying flat across the swells and the clouds had gone the color of dirty wool. The petrel moved under me in a slow, steady roll. Not enough to cause trouble, but enough that nothing stayed exactly where I left it.
You still there?
Callie asked. I'm here.
You sound like you're in a washing machine.
That's the radio. The boat's fine. The Petrel is a 38-foot survey boat, and I'm the only person on it. Sole operator, which is a professional way of saying if something breaks, I get to fix it, and if I can't fix it, then I get to sit there and think about how much fixing it would have cost. I do contract hydrographic survey work. Mostly I map the seafloor for people who have already decided what they want the seafloor to say. This job was for a fisheries dispute. There was a boundary out here that needed better information, and my job was to run the lines, collect the soundings, and produce a chart that would give both sides something else to argue about. It was a 6-week contract. I was 4 days in. This is the 11th solo contract I've taken, I said.
That's not what I asked.
I know.
How long have you been out there?
4 days.
Alvin.
I'm doing fine. The radio hissed again. I could hear the diesel generator running below the deck and the faint clicking of the survey computer as it saved another line. The water outside was almost black now. There were no other lights in sight. No boats, no harbor, nothing but the red and green glow from my own instruments reflected in the glass. Callie said something I didn't catch. Say that again.
I said, are you eating?
Yes.
What did you eat?
Food.
Alvin.
I looked toward the galley. There was a pot on the stove and a plate in the sink. I couldn't remember what had been in either of them. Probably something from one of the freeze-dried bags. They weren't bad if you followed the instructions, although most things aren't bad if you're hungry enough. I had dinner.
Was it an actual dinner?
It had calories.
That isn't what I asked.
It's fine, Callie. She went quiet for a second. Callie gets quiet when she's deciding how much of a fight she wants to have. Usually, she decides to have the fight.
You're supposed to call every evening.
She said. I am calling.
Tonight. You mean tonight? I mean every evening until you're back.
I know what every evening means.
Then promise me.
I looked down at the phone. The battery was low and the signal bars kept changing. 1 bar, then 2, then none. I had the navigation alarm set and the anchor watch running. The weather forecast was clear enough for the next couple of days, and there wasn't any reason I couldn't make a call. I promise.
Say it properly.
I'll call every evening. Even if nothing happened? Especially if nothing happened. That's when calls are easiest.
Alvin, listen. I need you to call every evening, even if nothing happened.
She said it like I was the one who had made the rule complicated. I didn't argue with her. Callie was the only person who reliably checked whether one of my contracts had ended safely. The clients checked their data. The insurance company checked the paperwork. Callie checked whether I was still somewhere in the world where a phone could ring.
You've got to be back in Portland by November 25th.
She said. I know.
For Mom's birthday.
I know that too.
You promised her.
I promised. She breathed out over the connection. It sounded like she was standing in her kitchen, even though I knew there was no reason I should be able to hear a kitchen through a phone. Callie had a way of making any room sound like it had a table in it and somebody waiting for you to sit down.
You can't extend the job,
she said. I'm not extending the job.
You say that now.
The contract ends on schedule.
And the weather?
The Pacific weather isn't going to interfere with the schedule.
You're sure?
The forecast is acceptable. I can make the return window.
Acceptable isn't the same as good.
It doesn't need to be good. It needs to be workable. That was how I usually explained weather to her. Not because she didn't understand it, but because weather was one of the few things she couldn't organize by asking me the same question 3 times. The petrol rolled a little harder and a loose cable tapped against the side of the console. I reached over and caught it before it could get wrapped around anything.
You're moving around,
Callie said. I'm checking the equipment.
Are you anchored?
Yes,
Is the anchor holding?
the anchor's holding.
How deep?
I looked at the display. 186 feet.
See, that's the kind of thing you could have told me without me asking.
I didn't think you wanted a depth reading.
I want to know you're safe.
I'm safe. She started to say something, but the connection broke up. Her voice came through in pieces and then cleared again.
Call me tomorrow.
I will.
Tomorrow evening.
I'll call tomorrow evening.
And you're coming home for Mom's birthday.
I'm coming home for Mom's birthday.
All right.
The line went quiet after that. I could still hear the static and the low hum of the boat, but Callie wasn't saying anything else. I waited a few seconds in case she was waiting for me to add something. I didn't have anything useful to add. The rest of the night passed with the petrol riding at anchor and the survey computer saving lines while I tried to sleep. Tried is the important part. The boat kept rolling, and every so often the anchor alarm gave a short beep from the wheelhouse. I got up twice to check the position, and once to look at the weather. Nothing had changed. The wind was still manageable, and the swell was coming in long enough apart that the boat had time to settle before the next one lifted it. By morning I had coffee in one hand and the survey controls in the other. The water looked different in daylight. It was gray and rough with white showing on the tops of the swells, and the clouds over Hecate ahead had flattened into one low sheet. I started the next line and lowered the sonar package over the side. The cable went down and the display filled with the usual broken shape of the seafloor. Usually is a useful word in survey work. It means you know what you're looking at well enough to notice when it changes. The bottom out there was not flat. It rose and fell around a drowned kelp forest, old trunks and rock shelves making irregular returns on the screen. Some of them were probably kelp. Some were probably rocks. There was no way to tell from one pass, and that was the reason for running the line again instead of deciding the whole thing was bad data. The fishery's boundary was supposed to follow the charted bottom. If the bottom wasn't where the chart said it was, then somebody was going to have a problem with the boundary, and that somebody wouldn't be me. My job was to record the returns and let other people argue about what they meant. I was halfway across the line when the cable jerked. It wasn't much, just a short vibration through the controls, and then the tension display climbed before dropping back down. I pulled the package up a few feet and watched the trace. Nothing. I lowered it again and the cable caught a second time. This time it held long enough to drag the boat's bow off the line. All right, I said. I marked the position and stopped the run. The obstruction was close enough to the petrol that I could make a dive without leaving the boat unattended for long. That was not the same as saying it was safe. 86 feet of water isn't deep by commercial diving standards, but standards get more flexible when you're alone and the weather is moving in. I checked the air, the regulator, the slate, and the cutting tool. The gauge was stable. I checked it again because the first check was done while I was thinking about the cable. Plenty of air. The reason I had taken the solo contract was to complete the chart. That was the reason I was 40 miles offshore by myself with a cable hung up on something below me. It wasn't a good reason to do something careless, but it was a good reason to find out what had caught the sonar package. I suited up and went over the side. The water closed around me cold enough to get my attention through the hood. I followed the line down and the petrol disappeared above me almost at once. The hull became a dark shape. Then it was gone behind the green water, and the swinging bubbles from my regulator. At 86 feet, the light was still there, but it didn't help much. Everything had the same color, and nothing looked close until I was nearly on top of it. The net lay across the bottom in a wide, loose sheet. It had caught on the old kelp trunks and spread between them, with floats along the upper edge and lead line buried in the weeds. The mesh moved in the swell, even though most of it was covered in growth. It looked less like fishing gear than something the ocean had been wearing for a long time. I moved toward the cable and my left fin went through the net. The mesh tightened around my ankle and pulled me sideways. I kicked once and made it worse. The net came up off the bottom and wrapped around the fin blade. I stopped moving. That was the first rule with tangled gear. Don't fight the thing that has you. Fighting it just gives it more of you. I reached for the cutting tool and worked the line closest to the fin. The mesh was stiff with growth and the blade kept sliding off. I cut through one float line, then another. The net pulled harder when the swell moved and the fin jerked against my leg. I could feel the pressure through the suit. I cut again, and the tension let go. The fin came free, but a section of mesh stayed looped around the ankle. I pulled it loose by hand and backed away from the net until I had room to work. The sonar cable was caught farther into the wreckage. I followed it through the kelp trunks and found where it had snagged. A section of net had wrapped around the lower part of the package. I cut through the floats one at a time and kept the loose mesh away from my legs. The last section was under the net. I reached beneath it with my right hand and closed my glove around something hard. It wasn't rock. Rock doesn't have corners. I pulled and felt the object shift under the mesh. The net had been wired around it, not tangled around it by accident. Wire ran through the mesh and around the handle, then disappeared under a layer of marine growth. I cut the wire. The object came loose with a cloud of brown material that drifted up in front of my mask. I brushed it away and saw an aluminum equipment case. It was the kind used for instruments or sensitive gear, although there wasn't enough left on it to tell me what had been inside. The surface was covered in barnacles and a dark mat of growth. It had a handle on one side and something heavy inside it that kept it down when I tried to lift it. It wasn't light enough to have drifted into the net. I checked the case twice. Heavy, solid. I pulled the recovery line from my harness and ran it around the handle. The knot took longer than it should have because the growth made everything slippery, and I didn't want to find out what happened if the case got loose at the wrong time. The line held. I brought the case up slowly. It dragged across the bottom and caught on the net twice. I cut more of the mesh away and kept pulling until it reached the open water below me. The Petrel's recovery line led up through the green water. I followed it with one hand and kept the case below me with the other. The weight came and went as the swell lifted it. Every time it dropped, I waited for the line to take the strain before moving again. Stable. 86 feet. At the surface, the Petrel was rolling harder than it had looked from below. I got one arm over the side and pulled the case in against the hull. It struck the aluminum with a dull bang and nearly pulled me back into the water when the boat lifted. I held on and waited. The next swell raised the case high enough for me to drag it over the gunwale. I got the recovery line across the deck and hauled the case after it. My gloves slipped on the growth and I had to change my grip twice, but the case finally came over and landed beside the line. Then I climbed aboard. The case was still dripping seawater and pieces of the drowned kelp forest. Someone had wired it to the net. It took me about 5 hours to get the case open. The case sat on the galley table where I'd left it, dripping seawater onto a folded rag. The growth had dried in places and turned the color of old leaves. It covered the hinges, the latches, and most of the wire that had been wrapped around the handle. I tried the latches first. They didn't move. I used a screwdriver and then a pair of pliers. The screwdriver slipped twice and cut the heel of my glove. The pliers got a grip on one latch but bent it without opening anything. I could have taken the case back outside and used a grinder, but I didn't have a grinder on the boat, and I wasn't going to start cutting into an unknown piece of equipment with a battery saw. That seemed like the kind of decision that usually got explained later in an accident report. I soaked the latches with penetrating oil and let them sit while I cleaned the rest of the case. Most of the marine growth came off in hard flakes. Underneath it, the aluminum was pitted and dark. The corrosion looked old, but the wire didn't. Or at least it didn't look like it had been sitting loose on the bottom. The growth covered the wire the same way it covered the case. Same color, same thickness. It looked like the wire and the case had been down there together for a long time. I didn't know how long that meant. A month, a year, longer. The oil helped a little. I got one latch loose and broke the other one off with the pliers. Then I worked a flat bar into the seam and leaned on it until the lid came up with a sharp metallic crack. Inside was a sealed plastic sleeve. It was tucked into the case with a layer of gray foam around it. The foam had gone soft and smelled like wet rubber, but the sleeve was intact. There was no water inside, no mud, no bits of kelp or anything else that should have been in there after being pulled across the bottom of the ocean. I cut the sleeve open along the top. The book inside had a dark blue cover with a Coast Guard emblem pressed into it. The cover was laminated, or had been laminated at some point, and the edges were yellowed. It was a dive logbook, not a maintenance manual and not a set of survey notes, the kind of book a diver used to write down what happened underwater while the details were still fresh. I opened it to the first page. Caden Carr. The name was printed at the top in block letters. Under it were lines for the unit, the date, and the operation. I got as far as the name before the radio started hissing. It was a hard burst of static from the wheelhouse. I looked up at the galley doorway and waited for it to stop. The sound faded, then came back louder. The radio was on the same channel I used for the harbor reports, although there wasn't any reason for it to be making that much noise out here. The antenna connection had been checked that morning. The set was working when I made the call to Callie. I closed the logbook. The radio hissed again. I took out my phone and photographed the case from both sides. I photographed the wire and the growth around it. Then I photographed the open case with the sleeve removed and the book lying beside it. The phone flash made the galley look brighter than it was. The case looked worse in the pictures, more damaged, more ordinary, if you didn't look at it very long. Lost equipment gets wet. It gets dirty. It gets damaged. If something spends enough time underwater, then the inside usually ends up looking about like the outside. I'd opened survey housings that had only been down for a few days and found water around the seals. This book had been pulled out of a net at 86 feet after being wired to the bottom, and the pages were dry enough to turn. I checked them again. Dry, intact. No swelling along the edges, no dark stains bleeding through the paper. The radio kept hissing from the wheelhouse. I left the book on the table and went up to check the set. The speaker was full of static, but there was no voice under it. I turned the volume down, checked the channel, and looked at the antenna display. Nothing there told me what was wrong. I went back to the galley. The first page still showed the name, Caden Carr. I didn't know who Caden Carr was or why his dive logbook had been sealed inside an aluminum case and wired into a fishing net. There was probably a reasonable explanation. Old equipment gets lost, things get moved by storms, nets catch on wreckage and drag it around. That kind of thing happens in the ocean. The dry pages were harder to explain. I was still looking at the book when the radio gave a sharp pop and Callie's voice came through.
Alvin,
Yeah,
are you there?
I'm here. There was a long hiss between us. I could hear the boat engine running and the refrigerator cycling on under the counter. The galley lights flickered once when the compressor kicked in.
Your signal's bad.
She said, "It's the radio.
You sound like you're standing in a storm drain.
The weather's fine."
I didn't ask about the weather. Did you find anything worth reporting?
I looked at the logbook. The cover was still wet around the edges. A few pieces of dried growth had fallen onto the table beside it. The name on the first page was easy to read even from where I was standing. "I recovered some old equipment," I said. "I'll explain it when I reach shore."
What kind of equipment?
"Some kind of case. It was caught in the net."
Is it dangerous?
"I don't know."
Alvin,
"It's probably not dangerous. I need to examine it."
don't bring it ashore if you aren't sure what it is.
"I'll handle it."
That's not what I said.
The connection broke apart. Her voice broke up and then vanished under the hiss. "I heard you,"
Call me tomorrow.
she said. "I will."
Tomorrow evening.
"I'll call tomorrow evening." The radio went quiet except for the static. I gave it a few seconds, but Callie didn't come back. I put the phone aside and went back to the logbook. I wasn't ready to tell her about the name. There wasn't much to tell, and that was part of it. A name without an explanation just gives somebody something else to worry about. Callie already had enough of that. I put the book beside the computer I used for surveys. I didn't open it again. The radio continued to hiss. The radio kept hissing for another 5 hours. I tried turning it off, but the static stopped with it and then came back when I switched it on again. I checked the power cable, the channel, and the antenna connection. Everything looked normal. The set was receiving something, although there wasn't a voice in it, and a harbor channel shouldn't sound like that 40 miles offshore. I lay down in the bunk and listened to it through the wall. That didn't work. Around midnight, I got up, made more coffee, and opened Caden Carr's logbook. The page I'd left it on was still dry. Moisture still darkened the edges of the dark blue cover. That was about all that had changed. The entries were from November of 2013. The Coast Guard stamp on the inside cover matched the unit information at the top of the page. I didn't know enough about Coast Guard records to identify the unit from the abbreviation, but I knew the stamp wasn't something I'd put there. The case had been down there for years. The book hadn't. The first entry described a search near Key Largo. The Ardent Wren was a shrimp trawler that had gone down in heavy swell. Caden wrote that the cutter had been trying to hold position, but the weather was getting worse and the crew couldn't stay over the wreck much longer. There could still be survivors in the lower compartments. The order was to search those compartments before the cutter had to leave. There were 2 divers in the water, Caden and Alfred. Caden's writing was small and even. He put the time and depth along the left side of the page and then wrote what they saw. The Ardent Wren had settled on its side with the hold partly collapsed. Nets hung from the upper structure and moved back and forth in the swell. Pipes had broken loose and were lying across the deck and down into the hold. Caden and Alfred entered through the hold. The water was full of silt at first. Their lights caught the pipes and nets in pieces and then lost them again. Alfred had the lead line. Caden stayed behind him and kept the line clear of the wreckage. The entry didn't say anything about them talking. It gave their positions and the condition of their equipment. Alfred was on his light. Caden's pressure was stable. The cutter was still transmitting updates through the divers' communications, although the signal broke up whenever they moved deeper into the trawler. I turned the page. The bulkhead door was rusted shut. Alfred forced it open with a pry bar while Caden held the light on the hinges. It took several attempts. The door moved a few inches, stopped, and then opened far enough for them to get through one at a time. On the other side was a passage. That didn't make much sense. Caden noted that the passage wasn't shown on the trawler's plans, but old wrecks have surprises in them. Added rooms, modified holds, places that got changed without anybody updating the drawings. He seemed to be making the same explanations I would have made. Then he wrote that the water was warm. Not warmer than the outside water. Warm. The sea near the wreck had been cold enough that both divers were wearing heavy exposure gear. Caden checked his temperature sensor twice and got the same reading. The passage water was warm against his gloves and around the seals of his suit. There was no current, no movement from the storm above, no suspended debris. Their lights went a long way down the passage. Caden wrote that the walls were metal and the floor was level. There were doors on both sides at regular intervals. Some were open, some were closed. He couldn't see the end. I stopped there for a second and looked toward the wheelhouse. The radio hissed through the wall. The sound was lower now, almost like somebody breathing with a bad connection. I could hear the refrigerator running under the counter and the boat working against the anchor. Nothing else. I turned back to the page. They continued down the passage because there was nowhere else to search and because the open doors might have led to survivors. Caden said the rooms were ship compartments, bunks, storage spaces, a narrow passage with pipes along the ceiling, all flooded, all empty. The trouble started when he turned around. The bulkhead door was gone. Caden went back to where it had been and found a plain metal wall. He checked the compass and then checked it again. Alfred swam past him and retraced their route. He came back through a doorway into another compartment, not the hold. It had the same warm water and the same clean visibility. There were pipes along one wall and a loose net caught near the ceiling. Alfred's light swept across a row of doors. He went through one and found another room, then another passage. The wreck was no longer connected the way a wreck should be connected. Caden wrote that they tried 3 different routes. Each one led into another flooded compartment. Some rooms were larger than the spaces inside the ardent wren could have been. Some had doors that opened into passages running in directions the trawler didn't have room for. Alfred was the one who started checking behind them. He'd swim 10 or 15 yards and come back with his light moving fast. Caden wrote that Alfred asked where the hold was. Caden told him to stay on the line. Alfred went back to look again. The next entry was only 2 lines. All routes continue into ship compartments. No return to wreck. I read that twice. The page after it had the same dark silt line I'd noticed before. It ran across the lower corner and stopped beneath Caden's writing. The book was supposed to be 11 years old. The paper had no water damage, no swelling, no stains except that one thin mark. I checked the date at the top of the entry against the Coast Guard stamp. November of 2013. The case had carried the stamp, the book, and whatever had happened to Caden and Alfred all the way to the bottom of the ocean. Then I looked at the mark again. It had the same narrow edge and broken center as the line on my dive slate. I got the slate from beside the computer running the survey. I placed it beside the open logbook and saw that the silt marks aligned. The light through the galley window had changed by the time I picked up the logbook again. It was morning now, although the sky still had the same flat gray color it had the night before. The radio had finally gone quiet. The refrigerator hummed, and the petrol shifted on the anchor. Caden's next entry started with the pressure gauge. It had stopped at 2,400 pounds per square inch. He checked it several times. Alfred checked it too. The reading didn't change. They'd been in the flooded compartments long enough that their reserve air should have been gone, but both of them were still breathing. Caden wrote down the time and then checked the gauge again. 2,400. The same as before. That was the sort of thing you checked twice because the first time you wanted it to be wrong. I read the entry again. The 2 divers had been moving through the rooms and trying every door they could find. None of them led outside. None of them led back to the ardent wren. Each one opened into another warm room from another ship. There were engine rooms with machinery still bolted to the deck, bunks stacked against walls, pipes running overhead and disappearing through bulkheads that shouldn't have connected to anything. Some passages were narrow enough that Alfred had to turn sideways to get through them. Others opened into spaces larger than the ships could have contained. Caden kept trying to explain it by the layout of the wrecks. Old ships had been rebuilt. Plans were wrong. Compartments had been added and sealed off. Maybe the rooms belonged to different vessels that had settled together over the years. That might explain one room. It didn't explain a passage that left a trawler and came out inside a cutter, or a bunk room with pipes that ran into a cargo hold from another ship. It didn't explain why every door led farther in. The gauge stayed at 2,400 pounds per square inch. Caden wrote that they were no longer using air from the tanks. They were breathing normally, but he couldn't say what they were breathing. The regulator worked when it was in his mouth. It delivered gas. His chest rose and fell. Alfred's did the same. Then the voice reached him. It didn't come through the regulator or through the communication system. Caden said he felt it in his jaw. The words came through the water and registered in his teeth. No one who breathes here surfaces in the same year they went down. Caden stopped writing after that for several lines. I could see where the pen had pressed into the paper hard enough to leave a mark on the page beneath it. The voice repeated the warning. Alfred tore the regulator out of his mouth to shout. Caden wrote that he expected Alfred to choke or drown. Instead, Alfred kept inhaling and exhaling the surrounding water. His chest moved the same way it had with the regulator in place. Bubbles came from his nose and mouth, but he didn't cough, and he didn't thrash. Caden tried to put the regulator back over his face. He couldn't. Alfred pushed his hand away and kept breathing the water. I put the logbook down and checked my dive computer. It still showed October 15th, 2024. The display was scratched across one corner from when I went through the net, but the date was clear. The time had advanced while I was reading. Nothing else on the screen looked wrong. I got my survey notebook from where I'd left it by the computer. The pages were full of depth readings and position marks from the previous 2 days. I found a blank space near the back and wrote the date down. Caden's first entry was November of 2013. The dates put the book at 11 years old. That was what the date said anyway. Caden and Alfred had gone into the Ardent Wren in November of 2013, and if the entries were accurate, they were still inside it, or inside something that had taken the place of it. I kept reading because the logbook documented 2 missing Coast Guard divers. That was the practical reason. It was also the only reason I had that didn't involve staring at the date until it changed. The later entries were shorter. Caden stopped trying to describe every room. He started making tally marks instead. The marks covered weeks and then months in the warm compartments. He noted the gauge each time, 2,400 pounds per square inch. It never moved. He wrote that his beard wasn't growing. There were cuts across both hands from the wreckage and the doors. They didn't heal, but they didn't become infected either. The skin stayed open and red around the edges. Alfred had a cut along one forearm and another across his knuckles. Caden said they looked the same every time he checked them. No swelling, no pus, no change. I looked at my own hands. The faint scar across my left palm was still there, and the small cuts from opening the case had closed up normally. The skin around one of them was stiff from dried blood. Nothing unusual. I returned to the notebook and looked at the date I'd written there. October 15th, 2024, beside Caden Carr's November 2013 date. The date in my notebook stayed where I'd written it, beside Caden's November 2013 entry. I returned to the logbook and kept reading. The tally marks covered several pages. Caden had stopped writing down every room and every door. He made a mark for each period of time he thought had passed, although he admitted he didn't know if the periods were days or weeks. The gauge still showed 2,400 pounds per square inch. His cuts were still open. Alfred was still breathing the water. Then Caden started describing the things that lived there. The first were pale and narrow, something like eels but thicker through the middle. They nested in the light fixtures above the passageways. At first he thought they were pieces of old cable or pale roots hanging down from the ceiling. Then one of them moved. It pulled itself out of the fixture and opened its mouth. The mouth split wide enough that Caden could see rows of human molars set into the gums. Not teeth shaped like molars. Human molars. He checked it with his light. and wrote that the teeth were different sizes and worn in different ways. Some had fillings. One had a dark metal crown. I read that part twice. The creature pulled back into the fixture when his light reached it. The others did the same. He found them in several rooms after that. They stayed still until he looked directly at them and then withdrew into the ceiling. Alfred wanted to go around them. He saw no reason to believe they could attack them, but there was no reason to get close enough to find out. That seemed reasonable. A few pages later, he described something else moving through the passageways. It was made of jointed hooks. Caden called it a structure. It had no body that he could see. The hooks linked together in a long drifting shape and moved along the ceiling as though they were pulling themselves forward. There was no current in the rooms. The water stayed still except for the movement made by the divers and whatever this thing did to travel. Caden watched it pass over him while he was standing in a compartment doorway. One of the hooks came close enough that his light showed the rough joints and the dark material inside them. It didn't touch him. He stayed in the room long enough to mark it on his slate. The hook structure returned. The entry said it came back along the ceiling in the same direction, although he couldn't tell how it had turned around. He left the room after that and didn't return until later. When he did, the thing was gone. He marked the room again anyway. It came back a second time. I stopped reading and looked at the galley ceiling. There were 2 light fixtures above the table. They were ordinary boat fixtures with plastic covers and rust around the screws. Nothing pale was pulled up inside them. Nothing moved when I put my hand on the switch. I turned the light off and back on. The fixture worked normally. I picked up the book again. The air pockets came after that. They were along the ceilings of several compartments and covered with barnacles. From below, they looked like bubbles trapped under the metal. Some were large enough for a person to fit into. They had flat bottoms and trembled when the divers touched them. He thought they might be an exit. They weren't. He examined them from 3 different compartments and found that they didn't connect to the outside. The air inside looked clear, but didn't behave like air he could use. He wrote that the pocket gave no pressure reading and that Alfred wouldn't put his face into it after the first attempt. Caden didn't explain what happened during that attempt. He only wrote that Alfred pulled away and checked his regulator twice. That was enough for me. By then, daylight through the galley window was white and weak. I had survey lines left to finish and a boat to run, so I closed the logbook and went up to the radio station. The Petrel was still sitting where I'd left her. The water was calm enough that the antenna barely moved against the sky. I completed the lines before dark. The next morning, I called Callie while the last set of readings saved. She answered on the second ring.
Alvin,
Yeah,
are you all right?
I'm fine.
You sound tired.
I've been awake.
That isn't the same thing.
The logbook lay on the bench beside me. I recovered a Coast Guard log. There was a pause.
From the case?
Yeah. It belonged to a diver who went missing in Florida in 2013.
Is that what you found underwater?
That's what I found in the case. I need you to search the public records from Portland.
Alvin, listen. What exactly are you asking me to look for?
Caden Carr, Coast Guard diver. There may have been another diver with him. Alfred Alvarez. She repeated the names so she could write them down.
And you want me to search for missing person records?
Public Coast Guard records. Anything about a search near Key Largo in November of 2013.
You could do that yourself.
I'm finishing the survey lines.
Of course you are.
I'll check the log while you search.
How long is that going to take?
I don't know.
Give me a time.
I'll call this evening.
That isn't a time.
I'll call you after the lines are done.
Alvin.
I'll call this evening. She was quiet for a moment.
Fine, but don't stay up all night doing this.
I'll call this evening. She made me repeat it once more before she hung up. The message came through later that afternoon. Callie had found the records. Caden Carr and Alfred Alvarez disappeared near Key Largo during a search in November 2013. Neither body was recovered. The Petrel's planned return date was still November 25th. At the bottom she had written, "Do not extend the contract over this." That night I opened the logbook again. The tally marks had reached the hundreds. Caden was no longer trying to guess how much time had passed. He recorded the pressure gauge and the condition of his hands. He noted when Alfred stopped answering questions. He noted that Alfred still followed the line. The rooms kept changing. New doors appeared where there had been walls. The pale things moved between fixtures. The jointed hooks continued along the ceilings whenever Caden stayed in one room long enough to mark it. Then he began seeing familiar faces. They appeared in distant rooms at the ends of passages. Some of them were familiar to him, but they belonged to neither him nor Alfred. He didn't say who they were. He only wrote that they watched from the doorways and moved away when the light reached them. I read that entry once. Then I opened Callie's message again and read her instruction not to extend the contract over the discovery. By late night, the computer I'd been using for surveys had gone to sleep and the galley was dark except for the light over the table. I'd made coffee a couple of hours earlier, but it had gone cold and I kept drinking it anyway. There wasn't much else to do while I read. The next entry started with Alfred. Caden found him in a compartment at the end of a passage. Alfred was kneeling on the deck with his head lowered and his regulator hanging loose against his chest. He was moving his mouth. At first, Caden thought Alfred was trying to clear his ears or speak through the communications system. Then he got closer and recognized the cadence. It was one they used on the cutter. Not a song exactly. More like a Coast Guard marching cadence, the kind they'd used during runs and equipment drills when they were both younger. Caden didn't write the words down. He only noted Alfred mouthing them in the correct order. Alfred hadn't deliberately responded to anything in months. He still kept to the line. He still moved when Caden pulled on it. He still looked at the lights and doors. But he didn't answer questions anymore. He didn't point out rooms or check the gauges. He just went along. Caden had started keeping his distance because of that. He didn't know what Alfred was thinking, or if he was thinking at all. The last time he got close, Alfred had turned away and stared at a blank wall for nearly an hour. This time, Caden approached him. The compartment was one of the larger ones. There were pipes along the ceiling and a row of bunks against the far wall. Caden said the water was clear all the way across. Alfred was kneeling near the center of the room with his hands resting on his thighs. He kept mouthing the cadence. Caden was about 10 feet away when something came down from the ceiling. It didn't fall. There was no sudden movement and no disturbance in the water. It just started lowering itself from above Alfred, a pale shape coming down through the light. Caden described it as being about the size of a man. That was about all he could say. It had the rough outline of a person, but no limbs, face, or other features. It was translucent enough that he could see the pipes through it. The edges moved in slow folds as it descended, although the water around it was still. Caden tried to reach Alfred. He pushed off the deck and swam forward with his light aimed at the thing. Alfred didn't look up. He kept mouthing the cadence. The pale mass reached the deck and spread around him. Caden could see Alfred inside it. The shape closed over Alfred's helmet and tanks. It covered the rig and the dog tags at his throat. Caden was still moving toward him when the mass tightened and drew upward. Alfred disappeared inside it. Caden reached the spot a second later. There was nothing there. No body, no equipment, no bubbles except the ones coming from Caden's own regulator. The pale shape pulled itself back into the ceiling and vanished between the pipes. Then somebody was hanging in the water where Alfred had been. He was wearing Alfred's rig. The tanks, mask, gloves, and dog tags were all the same. Caden checked the tags because he needed to make sure he hadn't lost his mind. Alfred Alvarez. The diver inside the rig was younger than Alfred. Caden estimated early 20s. He had a narrow face and no scar on his cheek. He was breathing without a regulator in his mouth. His chest moved slowly. He looked at Caden and didn't recognize him. Caden reached for the man's shoulder. The younger diver pulled away. He didn't panic. He didn't try to swim for the line. He just looked at Caden with a blank, careful expression. Then the voice came. Caden said it was in his jaw again. He felt the words in his teeth. He was born here. He will breathe here. I put the book down for a minute. The refrigerator kicked on beneath the counter. The sound was normal, and I was glad to have something normal to listen to. I checked the door to the galley even though I knew it was closed. The petrol shifted under me, and the coffee moved in the cup. Caden went back to the younger diver. He wrote that the place kept people alive. It kept their bodies from changing and supplied them with whatever they needed to breathe. It took away the part that knew where they came from. Alfred was gone, but the equipment remained. The person wearing it had been left without Alfred's memories or name. That was Caden's conclusion anyway. He said he had no better explanation. A few entries later, he wrote that some of the faces watching from the doorways had his features. Not looked like him, had his features. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same scar through his eyebrow. He started checking his reflection in the dark glass of his dive mask, but the water and the light made it hard to see anything clearly. He wrote that he might already have been replaced and simply didn't know it. The logbook was the only proof that he had once been Caden Carr. I read that line 3 times. Then I turned back through the older pages and looked at the handwriting. The first entries had been small and even. The later ones were tighter and harder to read, with the letters pushed together where Caden had been writing quickly. But it was the same hand, the same crooked cross on the T's, the same way he made the number 4 with an open top. I checked my survey notebook. The page with my date was next to the computer. Under it, I'd written a line while I was trying to keep track of the years and the rooms. Count what you can verify. I knew I'd written it. I could see my own handwriting. What I didn't know was where I'd first heard it. I turned to the newest page in Caden's logbook. Near the bottom, he had written the same phrase in the same roughened hand. Count what you can verify. I turned the page and found the final entry. It was shorter than the ones before it. Caden had stopped trying to explain the rooms by then. There were no lists of doors or tally marks, no notes about the gauge or Alfred, just a description of one flooded compartment and the thing he found at the far end of it. The compartment was like the others in most ways. The ceiling was lined with pipes, and metal ribs ran down the walls. The deck was covered with silt and small pieces of wreckage. He wrote that the water was warm enough to feel through his gloves. The bulkhead door was different. He noticed the seam first. Water was coming through it in thin lines, but it wasn't the warm water from the room. It was cold, real ocean cold, the kind that made his fingers ache when he held them against the metal. Caden put his hand on the seam and left it there for several seconds. The skin at the ends of his fingers went numb. He said the water smelled like the open ocean. That detail bothered me more than the cold. The rooms had smelled like rust, old oil, wet metal, and whatever passed for water in that place. He'd described it several times. There was no current and no salt taste. The water kept him alive, but it wasn't ocean water. Now there was a door that smelled like the ocean on the other side. I checked the galley around me. The refrigerator was still running. The radio was quiet. Beside the table, the case rested on the floor with the wire cutters and the remains of the kelp piled next to it. Nothing smelled like the ocean except the case. He tried to open the door. He pushed against it with both hands first. The bulkhead didn't move. He braced one foot against the deck and pulled on the edge of the seam until his shoulders shook. The cold water kept running over his gloves. He tried using a length of metal from the wreckage as a lever, but the tool slipped and struck the wall. He rested for a while after that. The next attempt went the same way, then the one after that. Each time he got weaker. His arm stopped working properly and his breathing became harder to control. The door stayed closed. The seam didn't widen. The cold water continued to come through at the same rate. That was the part I understood. If you force something long enough without changing it, eventually you're not working on the thing anymore. You're just using yourself up against it. The entry said he couldn't pass through the bulkhead. He couldn't save his body and he couldn't force the door. But the seam was wide enough for the case. I read that sentence again. The only proof he had left was in the logbook. He'd written that before, but this time he was making a plan around it. He took the pages apart and laminated them in sections using clear material from one of the rooms. I don't know what that material was. He said it held when he bent it and didn't let water through. He put the pages inside the aluminum case. The case was the same one I'd recovered. The hinges had been grown over with whatever had been on the wreckage, but the aluminum underneath was still in good shape. Caden wired it shut after he put the logbook inside. He added enough weight to make it sink in ordinary seawater. He didn't know where it would go after that. He only knew that the cold seam led somewhere else. I could picture him working on the case in that room. The same case I'd dragged over the side of the Petrel 4 days earlier. The same wire still circled the handle. Caden had sent it through an opening he couldn't enter, and somehow it had reached Oregon. 11 years had passed on the calendar. 4 days had passed between the timestamp in the case and the morning I found it in the net. I didn't have a way to make those facts agree. Caden forced the case through the seam one section at a time. The cold water pulled at it from the other side. He said he had to keep both hands on the case and push until the metal caught against the edge of the bulkhead. Then he would change his grip and push again. The water beyond the seam took the front end first. Once it had the case, it kept pulling. He nearly lost it twice. The room behind him stayed warm. The water in front of him was cold enough to numb his hands through the gloves. He held on until the case was mostly through, then let it go. The last part of the entry was written in a smaller space at the bottom of the page. His handwriting had gotten rougher. Some of the letters ran into each other, but I could still read them. The last line said, "I am still below and counting." If you read this in daylight. Caden Carr breathed until the end. I sat there with my hand on the page. I checked the electronic timestamp. It was 4 days before I found the case. Not 11 years before. 4 days. The timestamp put the entry in the same week as the dive, though Caden had entered the Ardent Wren in November of 2013. I got my dive computer from beside the survey notebook. The dive computer still read October 15th, 2024. I checked the Petrel's navigation clock next. It showed the same date. The time was different by a few seconds, which was normal for those systems. My wristwatch showed October 15th, too. I looked at all 3 displays for longer than I needed to. The dive computer had the scratch across one corner. The navigation clock had a smear of dried salt under the lower edge. My watch was still running a little fast, like it always did. I took photographs of the timestamp and the final page. Then I put the logbook back inside the aluminum case and shut the lid. The wire was difficult to twist back into place, but I got it tight enough to secure the case with the photographed logbook inside. The Petrel stayed at anchor through the rest of the night, with the case shut beside me. I didn't sleep much. I went over the case twice, even though the wire was still tight and the lid hadn't moved. I checked the navigation clock too. It read October 15th, 2024, same as before. Around morning, I called Callie. She answered after a few rings.
Alvin?
Yeah.
You sound awful.
I didn't sleep.
That isn't what I asked.
I looked at the case on the floor beside the table. The final entry was written 3 days ago. There was a pause.
3 days ago when?
According to the timestamp, the entry was made 3 days before I recovered the case.
Alvin, Caden disappeared 11 years and 2 months ago.
I know.
And his last entry was 3 days old.
That's what the timestamp says. Callie said nothing for a moment. I could hear something running on her end, probably the refrigerator. Callie has always been bad at being quiet without doing something else at the same time.
Leave the case where it is,
She said.
Don't open it again. Don't take anything out.
It's already closed.
Leave it untouched.
I have survey lines to finish.
Then finish the survey lines. After that, we'll deal with it.
We?
Yes, I'm going to contact a marine biologist before you bring it ashore.
I didn't argue with that. Francis had already been looking at the photographs and the growth on the case, but looking at pictures wasn't the same as looking at the case itself. If anybody could tell us how long something had been underwater, it would be somebody who worked with marine organisms. All right, I said.
And don't put anything else in the report.
I wasn't going to.
You were thinking about it.
I was thinking about what the report should say.
That's the same thing with you.
She made me promise to leave the case alone again before she hung up. I wrote down the time of the call and went up to the survey station. The remaining lines ran over the drowned kelp forest. I finished them because the contract was still open, and because abandoning the survey wouldn't make the case easier to explain. It would leave the fisheries chart incomplete and keep me on the petrel longer while I tried to work out a timestamp that didn't belong anywhere near the ocean floor. The computer saved each line without complaint. The depth readings stayed consistent. The water moved over the old kelp, and the net came through clean except for a few pieces of growth caught in the floats. I reported the case as recovered gear with an uncertain origin. I didn't mention the rooms, the flooded compartments, or the cold water coming through a door that was supposed to be part of a wreck. There wasn't a box on the form for any of that anyway. The petrel returned to Newport that afternoon. Callie had arranged for Francis to meet me at her marine biology workspace near the harbor. I carried the case inside with both hands. It was heavier than it had been on the petrel. Maybe that was because I was tired. Maybe because I knew what was inside it. Francis was waiting at a stainless steel table with a magnifying lamp and several shallow trays laid out beside it. She wore gloves and had her hair clipped back. There was a small camera mounted over the table pointed at the work surface.
You brought the whole case,
She said. Callie said you wanted to see it untouched.
I said I wanted to examine it before anyone disturbed the contents.
That sounds like the same thing.
It's close enough.
I set the case on the table. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked at the growth around the hinges and the wire on the handle. Then she leaned over the case and studied the crust along one corner.
How long was it underwater?
I don't know.
Where did you recover it?
Off the Oregon coast.
How deep?
Deep enough to bring up a lot of kelp with it. She looked at me.
That isn't a measurement.
No, I didn't record the exact depth of the net. Francis made a note on a pad. She took photographs first. Then she scraped small samples from the growth and placed them in the trays. The work took longer than I expected. She examined some pieces under magnification and crushed others between the ends of a pair of tweezers. The room smelled like salt, disinfectant, and wet rock. There were tanks along one wall with pumps running inside them. I couldn't identify most of what was in them. Small fish in one, something pale and branching in another. After about an hour, she took off her gloves.
Based on the evidence,
She said,
the organisms in mineral deposits require at least 10 years of continuous submersion.
in Pacific water.
Yes. The species are consistent with the Pacific and the mineral deposits match the local conditions. I can't give you an exact date, but this wasn't sitting underwater for a few months.
I looked at the case. Could it have been moved?
Moved after the growth developed?
At some point.
It could have been, but the growth formed while the case was submerged. There are no clean breaks where somebody removed it and put it somewhere else.
Could the growth have formed faster?
Not at that rate. Not based on the evidence.
She paused before adding the last part.
At least 10 years. probably longer.
That was the part I couldn't account for. The case had been in Pacific seawater for more than 11 years, and Caden's last entry had been made 4 days before I found it. Those facts didn't fit together any better in Francis's workspace than they had in the galley. I went to the Coast Guard records office in Newport before I turned in the report. The search took most of the afternoon. Caden Carr and Alfred Alvarez were listed as missing in the waters off Key Largo on November 18, 2013. Both were Coast Guard divers. Neither body had been recovered. Neither man's equipment had been recovered either. The record didn't say anything about an aluminum case. It didn't say anything about Oregon. There was no mention of the petrel or the drowned kelp forest or the flooded rooms. As far as the official record went, 2 divers had disappeared in Florida and left nothing behind. I carried the copies back to the harbor and sat in the truck for a while with the case on the passenger seat. Callie called before I could start the engine.
Did Francis examine it?
She did.
What did she say?
At least 10 years in continuous Pacific seawater, probably longer. All right. That doesn't agree with the timestamp. I know. The Coast Guard records don't agree with it either.
What do you mean?
Caden and Alfred disappeared near Key Largo. Their equipment was never recovered.
Alvin, listen. Don't add anything you can't explain.
I can't explain any of it.
Then don't put it in the report.
I looked through the windshield at the harbor. A fishing boat was coming in slow with a gull sitting on the roof of the wheelhouse. The case is real, I said.
I know the case is real.
The growth is real. I know. The logbook is real. She didn't answer right away.
Turn in the case,
she said.
Turn in the photographs. Say the provenance is unknown. That's all.
I knew she was right. That didn't make it easier. I filled out the found gear report in the harbor office. I listed the aluminum case, the wire, the marine growth, and the photographs. I wrote that the recovered material had been delivered for examination and that the original source could not be confirmed. There was a line asking for the object's history. I left it blank. The logbook sat inside the case while I filled out the paperwork. Caden's handwriting remained on the pages. The final entry read, "I am still below and counting." I could have included a copy. I could have written down the name and the date and the timestamp, but I couldn't explain the distance between Key Largo and Oregon, or the 11 years of growth, or how a man who had been missing since 2013 had written an entry 4 days before I found the case. So I signed the found gear report as provenance unknown and left Caden Carr's account out of it. The next morning, I took the Petrel out for the last survey dive. Most of the work was done before I visited the Coast Guard records office, but a few lines near the edge of the kelp bed were still left. The contract was almost done. Once I finished those lines, I could head back to Newport, secure the boat, and go home. That was the plan anyway. I checked the air supply before I dropped below the surface. The gauge was full enough for the dive and the reserve was where it should be. I checked the straps, the regulator, and the computer on my wrist. Everything was normal. I'd done that same check every time I went into the water. This time I kept looking at the gauge. The descent was slow because of the current. The water closed over my head and the Petrel turned into a blurred shape above me. I watched the gauge as I went down. The needle moved the way it was supposed to. It didn't jump ahead. It didn't stop. It didn't show a reading that belonged to some other dive. The seafloor came up beneath me. There was the kelp, the net, and the same gray water I'd been working in for nearly a week. The fronds moved back and forth with the swell. Small fish scattered when my light passed over them. Nothing was waiting between the rocks. Nothing came through a door that wasn't there. I held the survey line in one hand and kept the other near the gauge. The computer saved the readings. Depth, temperature, position. The numbers were ordinary. The water was cold. The visibility was poor near the bottom, but better above it. The kelp forest looked like a kelp forest. That was the good part. I still checked the gauge every few seconds. It stayed stable through the bottom of the dive. When I started back up, it fell normally as the pressure dropped and the air came out of the tank. I watched it all the way to the surface. The needle moved in small, steady increments, and the computer showed the ascent rate I expected. The Oregon water had not changed. I reached the surface and held on to the recovery line. The petrel was rolling a little in the swell. I could hear the engine and the slap of water against the hull. Before I removed my mask, I looked at my wristwatch. October 21st, 2024. I looked at the date a second time because the first look hadn't settled me. The date hadn't moved. The time was a little after 9 in the morning. The watch was still running fast by a few seconds like it always did, but it was showing the same day as the dive computer. I left the mask on for another minute. Then I climbed aboard. The rest of the morning went the way the other survey mornings had gone. I rinsed the gear, saved the last lines, and brought the petrel toward Newport. The computer finished writing the files without an error. The radio stayed quiet. The water behind the boat was just water. I kept the case's facts with me anyway. Caden's logbook had come through the cold seam from the flooded rooms. The case had crossed from a place that wasn't supposed to exist and arrived in an Oregon fishing net without Caden. His final entry was dated 4 days before the case turned up in my hands. The growth on the case pointed to at least 11 years underwater. Those facts didn't get any better when I put them in order. They just took up more space. At the harbor, I tied the petrel to its usual spot and shut down the engine. The clock on the dock office showed October 21st, 2024. I compared it with the computer on my wrist before I took off my gloves. Same day. The clock had a few seconds on the computer. That was normal. I checked the date anyway. Callie answered when I called her.
Alvin?
Yeah,
You back in?
just secured the petrel.
How'd the last dive go?
Fine. The readings were clean. I finished the remaining lines. She didn't say anything for a moment.
You sound tired.
I've been diving most of the week.
I know. I'm asking how you are.
I looked across the harbor at the boats tied along the far side. The morning fog had lifted and there was sunlight on the roofs. I'm all right.
That's not much of an answer.
The dive computer worked normally. The air gauge was stable on the way down and it dropped normally on the way up.
Alvin.
I'm going home.
Yes, you are.
I'll be home for Mom's birthday. Callie breathed out. I could hear traffic behind her, or maybe a fan. She always seemed to have some kind of noise around her when we talked.
November 25th.
She said.
You remember the date? November 25th. And you're not extending the contract?
No, the Oregon work is done.
You're coming home.
I said I was.
You said you'd be back before Mom's birthday.
Then I'll be back before Mom's birthday. She was quiet again. I knew she wanted to ask about the case. I knew she wanted to ask whether Francis had found anything else, or whether the records office had turned up something that made the logbook easier to explain. She didn't ask. I didn't tell her that I had checked the date when I surfaced. I kept the harbor check to myself. I couldn't think of a useful way to say it. If I told her I was checking the date every time I came out of the water, then she'd ask why. If I told her why, then we'd be back to the case, the timestamp, and the 11 years of growth. I was tired of hearing those facts in my own voice. I'll call you tonight, I said.
Call me when you leave Newport.
I will.
And drive carefully.
I know how to drive.
That isn't what I said.
I'll call when I leave.
All right.
We hung up. I stood beside the petrel for a while with the phone in my hand. The lines were still wet on the deck and there was a smear of kelp growth near the aft rail from the last recovery job. Most of it had washed away by then. A few brown pieces had caught in the drain and I pulled them loose with my glove. The harbor smelled like diesel, salt, and old wood. Nothing else. I checked my watch again. It still read October 21st, 2024. The petrol was secured. The lines were tight. The engine was off and the boat had settled against the fenders. I had my bag in one hand and the keys in the other, but I didn't leave yet. I watched the second hand move around the face. The date stayed where it was.